that says,
Yeah.
hey, if we can't even run the SQL, it's probably wrong. So let's try again. Let's try something different.
So that Genie doesn't start to mess up your data.
How much can we actually automate? How much can we actually just handle this in the base models?
Help the the users have more confidence in the answer.
There are, by the way, valid instances where we generate SQL that's wrong, but that's because we didn't actually have enough context.
Hey folks, today we have a superstar. We have Chao Tai, Senior Director Engineering of the AIBI, aka AIBI Dashboards and AIBI Genie. And of course we have Hugh with us.
Right there. Hey, Chao.
How's it going?
Can you introduce yourself and tell us more about you?
Oh boy. All right. First of all, ignore everything Yusuf said about superstar. Nothing I've done has earned any of that praise. I'm Chao. I work on AIBI, which is basically Databricks' solutions that are trying to make Databricks a lot more accessible to a whole lot more people. Hopefully folks who don't even need to have technical sophistication to be able to access and use Databricks in the ways of dashboards, which you all know what dashboards are, and Genie, which is a way for you to directly talk to the data and get hopefully good answers back. I've been working in this space for quite a few years. I used to be at Google working on products such as Google Analytics, basically focusing on helping marketers and advertisers talk to their data, in effect, and understand their data. And a couple of years ago, I was talking to some of the folks from Databricks and basically came up with this idea where we could try to expand this to a lot more than just marketers and advertisers. Let's actually try to make data accessible to every single function, every single company out there. And so a lot of the ideas behind AIBI came out of that.
And trust me, Genie is really simplifying how people are accessing and asking questions and having fast answers to every single question they are asking, specifically like the easy ones that goes like, hey, tell me more about how many sales I did last week, how many failures we had, how many tickets were opened, do me the aggregation, add some specific details. So we'll deep dive more on this a little bit later.
So I think Ali announced AIBI at Databricks and AI Summit on scene. Can you, I mean, before Databricks, we had dashboards. I think we had dashboards V2, Lakeviews, and now we have AIBI dashboards / Lakeview. Can you tell us what's going on here?
Yeah, so AIBI dashboards is just a rebranding of Lakeview dashboards. They're the same thing. Prior to that, we had sort of some dashboarding functionality inside of Databricks SQL already, and some of that came out of an earlier sort of Redash acquisition and sort of the revamp and sort of the rebuild within that into Databricks. We basically looked at that and said, okay, currently dashboards is sort of a feature of data warehousing, but we'd like to actually make it its own first-class citizen so that it can actually focus more on sort of expanding this capability known as business intelligence to as many people as possible to make it as useful to as many companies as possible. And so that's where we basically refactored dashboards out of some of the data warehousing stuff and started focusing on it as its own standalone effort. And then along the way, coincidentally, sort of the person who started Redash, Arik, was doing a hackathon with another engineer, Simon, who basically around this concept of, hey, Databricks is still sort of a little too hard to use in getting access to its data for any person. And so let's actually try to see if we can rethink things from scratch. And the project that eventually became Genie came out of that.
So if I recap, so Databricks had nothing, no BI, no dashboards. And then we had the acquisition of Redash. When was it, like 3 years
A couple years ago, yeah.
2020, I guess, if I'm not wrong.
Yeah, 2001. It's 3 years ago now, yeah.
3 years ago. And then we did the first dashboard based on Redash. And then we did an update on that called Lakeview so that it's much easier to create the queries and manage everything. But yet it wasn't enough. And I feel like all the AI thing was missing. And that's where the AIBI dashboards comes in.
Yeah, so I would say Genie is sort of a confluence of a couple of different efforts. One being this hackathon I mentioned, where we started exploring this idea of what is the right interface for people to get access to their data much more easily, ideally talk to their data, since at the time Gen AI was just sort of starting to become really popular overnight. And then the other was sort of the underlying research around things like text-to-SQL, which some of our ML teams started doing in parallel, and saying, how much can we actually automate? How much can we actually just handle this in the base models versus how much do we actually need to sort of talk to users and get more context from them?
And just to clarify for the folks who are still using Databricks SQL, the legacy dashboards, they can migrate them easily to Lakeview with a button on the top, and make sure to do it.
That's right. There's a clone button. We try to make it as easy as possible, but if you feel like it's still too hard, give us feedback.
And Chao, you told us that Genie started with hackathon. So can you tell us more about the steps that we followed? I mean, for my case, I only was able to track the name, the rebranding. We started with called Project 1B, then was called Data Rooms, then it switched to Genie.
Yeah, we renamed it a fair bit. Honestly, the name was sort of many times secondary to the effort itself, which was really trying to say, okay, 1B, the original name of it, was basically saying, let's see how quickly we can actually get this to 1 billion users. Right? That was what 1B was for. And a lot of the goal and the spirit behind that was, let's make a version of Databricks that's as simple for people to use as possible so that as many people can use it as possible. And so the idea of it was, okay, what's simpler than just talking and asking English natural language questions or any language natural language questions and getting answers back accurately? Of course, this is a really hard challenge on many layers, starting with how do you actually build the right models to actually understand your data correctly and answer the questions as accurately as possible. And that's assuming we have all the context, but we don't. So how do you actually build the right interfaces so that we can get context from people as effectively as possible, make that work as easy as possible? So there's a lot of interesting challenges that come into Genie, but the focus originally with the hackathon was, okay, let's actually get the interface right for the person who's ultimately trying to make data-driven decisions. Let's actually try to make sure that it's possible for folks to be able to sort of ask questions, get answers back, trust those answers, potentially verify if they have the technical sophistication to do so, and sort of make sure that that workflow and that feedback loop is as sort of clean as possible. And then, of course, you got to solve all the hard problems around it, like how do you actually make sure that the answer is right as often as possible.
So for everybody, Genie is the place where you can go and you ask like plain English question, like, hey, can you give me an insight on something? And then you have all the magic happening behind the scenes. So Databricks kind of knowing your data, understanding your question, is going to write down a SQL query, generate the visualization, and give you back the answer so that any business user can get an insight, basically. I think a good flow, what I like to show when I do that is, hey, typically you would have a Lakeview dashboard. So like it's a dashboard that you share, like the BI team build, and you share the dashboard with your business team. And then from the dashboard, you would see that maybe something is wrong. Something is triggering your attention. There is something you need to deal with. But often the answer is not directly in the dashboard. So before that, you will need to go back, ask the analyst, hey, can you give me some insight and extract on that and that and that, so which is really slow and it can take a couple of days or weeks. And now the business user can just open the Genie room from the dashboard and say, hey, can you give me more details on whatever they want to know? And then the engine is going to do the magic behind. Can you tell us more about like how is it working? How do you, because it's really working well, and I know there is a lot of secret sauce behind, but can you try to go into details and tell us how you made the magic?
We debated a lot, honestly, on like if you have Genie spaces, do you even still need dashboards, for example? And we basically settled on yes, dashboards are there for the top 10% of sort of recurring every day. You always want to kind of check on those kind of questions. And Genie's for the digging deeper, the bottom 90%, if you will, of questions that a dashboard will not be able to answer because sort of you're not going to have the data analyst's attention to be able to build every single potential sort of slicing of a particular dashboard to be able to answer every single fine-grained query. And so we thought of Genie ultimately as that kind of complement. And so the way we built it is in some ways reflective of that. It starts out with more of a general purpose model. Your sort of the general ability to answer a sort of text-to-SQL standard questions across all customers in a standard way. And that's something that to be fair, we haven't perfected yet, right? We're improving all the time, and it's able to get good answers on many classes of queries. It still fumbles on some classes, and we're working on closing those. And a lot of the work here is actually in working with customers, getting their feedback on what classes of queries are most important for them, and then making sure that we're able to prioritize sort of improving those and making those as accurate as possible. So that's the base model.
To clarify for everybody, when you say base model, it could be, for example, I know Llama 3 that we fine-tune to do text-to-SQL, something like that.
Yeah, in some ways, so the way we've sort of framed our solution is this notion of sort of a compound AI system. And the reason we did so is because the individual models involved in some ways are slightly secondary to the fact that it's a composite of several different models, each solving a particular subproblem. For example, the subproblem of generating SQL, the subproblem of explaining what the SQL is doing, the subproblem of figuring out what are valid table values, column values that are even eligible to be put into the where clause, the subproblem of suggesting what are potential interesting questions for you to ask. All of those, each of those could in theory be powered by a different model. And that's okay, because we're looking for basically best of breed across all of these models. Some of them may be fine-tuned, some of them prompt engineered, etc., in order to actually deliver the most accurate answers and the best experience for every customer. And so in that regard, the most important piece of this that is often easy to overlook is the feedback loop itself, is how we actually verify, given a particular composition of models, is it actually doing better than the last thing we were doing? And is it actually doing good enough for all the customers, most of the customers, et cetera? This is especially hard because, we actually should not be, and we will not touch any customer's data or the questions that they're asking without their permission. And by default, we do not do so, which means that we do not actually directly learn whenever they get an answer right or get an answer wrong most of the time. We only learn when they complain to us and say, hey, this is actually wrong. And so the feedback loop is actually fairly lossy in that regard. So we've had to do a lot of interesting sort of innovations on the data that we do have, on whether it's synthetic data or whether it's data that's used within Databricks itself or various other things, in order to have a tight enough feedback loop to be able to learn and iterate enough on the models.
Carbon systems and multiple submodel trying, to do their best to provide something at each step of the
literally. That's
yeah, and so typical flow would be, hey, based on, I guess, first of all, give me all the schema. We get the schema. Based on the schema, can you try to write the SQL? Then I imagine we will try to run the SQL. If it's failing, we try to fix it, and some kind of chain of top.
That's right. Yeah. In very early iterations of Genie, right, it would actually generate SQL that was not even runnable by Databricks itself. So that's a very clear feedback loop for us that says, hey, if we can't even run the SQL, it's probably wrong. So let's try again. Let's try something different. There are, by the way, valid instances where we generate SQL that's wrong, but that's because we didn't actually have enough context. Right? Like, for example, we may generate a column value that doesn't even exist in the database. But then we don't have enough context around, is that because simply in the range of data that we're looking at, that value just didn't occur? Or is that actually because that value is completely invalid, hallucinated, made up by someone? And so that's where additional context in the form of things like instructions, in the form of things like column comments, et cetera, is super helpful to actually let us sort of constrain the search space a little bit.
Yeah, and since you talk about comments on columns, we know that Unity Catalog made this possible because we have some metadata linked to every single table, comments on the table, comments for every single columns. So how did UC make or help Genie becoming a reality?
Yeah, UC, I think, is a necessary building block to something like Genie, in the sense that you need a source of truth for not just governance, but semantics. And UC is increasingly, starting with things like comments, going from just a place where you declare, hey, this is who can access what, to, hey, this is actually what my data means. And if you think about it, Genie is built off, like I mentioned, that general purpose model that is the same across all customers. But then the secret sauce on top of it is actually we're trying to learn on your data as a customer. And we're trying to refine Genie to be most useful for your data. And that can only happen if you have the right context provided in places like UC for it. Otherwise, we're just guessing.
And you just mentioned security. I imagine, I mean, I would be concerned about security. Like when you run the query, you have to make sure that Genie runs the query only on what the current user can see, and you don't leak anything.
Yeah.
Is that a big challenge?
Yeah, so the nice thing is Genie doesn't actually have to worry about a lot of that itself because it's largely just generating the queries, but then it's talking to existing Databricks services, like, for example, the SQL execution API. And it's running the queries through those. So all of the governance around who can see the queries, who can see the results, etc., is already handled by the Databricks SQL layers. And Genie sort of just interacting with it as a client application, very similar to, say, a third-party BI tool built on top of us.
Yeah, I guess you just have to make sure it's a read-only system so that Genie doesn't start to mess up your data.
That's right. It is, yeah, both Genie and actually AIBI dashboards are set up to be read-only. We get bugs or filed complaints at times from folks who are like, hey, I want to actually use my dashboards or Genie to alter my database in a certain way. And we have to explain to them, no, this is why that's
Yeah.
It's not possible.
And no, it's feasible, but we're not going to build it. Sorry.
And just like we know that Genie now relies on, as I mentioned, comments and comments over columns and table. Are we thinking about adding, for example, access to the query history so we can understand how many times users are querying this table, maybe also the relevant details, because now if you go to table insights, for every single table, you're going to see the users who query this table most, the queries you run most on this table, and also the tables you join the most with this one. So is Genie able to access all those details, or it's in the roadmap?
I would say it's something we're actively researching. Query history, lineage, any of the things that give us more context about not just what the meaning of the data is, but also sort of who thinks the data means what and who can be trusted over time. We have to infer a whole lot of that. And then the way we'll probably approach it is to try to infer as much as possible, but then also try to suggest some of it to the folks who are sort of curating the Genie spaces, not necessarily just the people who are using it, but the people who are curating it, and say, hey, we're inferring that this might be what the data means. We're inferring that this might actually be the semantics behind this particular column or this particular table. Are we right about that? Right. So like some of this might actually go back into table columns and columns as AI suggestions so that we actually capture that and have the validation loop there. Some of it will go directly into Genie because we can actually just directly use it. So we'll probably do some of each of those things because ultimately we're trying to make sure that this doesn't just serve a single user or a single group of users, but it serves the whole organization and it has the right governance and the right sort of validation built in so that everyone can actually check for, is this right or not?
I feel like on this system, there is a big question and maybe issue on trust. Because if I ask a question and the system is giving me back, something, if I am to take action based on the insight, I really need to trust the actual results. And like one way to trust it is to actually see the SQL query and make sure it's okay. But typically business analysts won't know exactly if it's trustable. So what's your thinking about that and how can we solve it?
Yeah, no, this is one of the hardest problems for something like Genie, which is how do you actually establish trust and also not create overconfidence for everyone who's using it, both the technical and the business users. For the technical users, as you mentioned, it's a little easier because if they can speak SQL, they can validate SQL. That's great. For the business users, things we've tried to do in this regard are things like, for example, trying to give a sort of a natural language explanation of what the SQL is doing. So they have a way of sort of sanity checking, is that actually headed in the right direction? And we're also exploring these sort of notions of sort of certified or validated functions, certified or validated sort of queries, answers, etc., as a way of basically saying, hey, you may not be able to understand what this is doing, but you can trust the author of this sort of thing that we're using. You can sort of trust the author of the tool rather than know the internals of the tools itself. So it becomes more trusting the people who created and validated these answers rather than trusting the answer itself. And if you think about it, this is how a dashboard works today, right? Like if you're using a dashboard, you're not looking at the underlying SQL a fair bit of the instances. You're sort of trusting that the author is competent and has generated the right things.
Yeah, so we could have a system where SQL experts kind of build metrics and save the metrics and explain what each metric is doing. And then at the end, the AI would be just in charge of kind of composing the queries based on the metric. And you can kind of trust
and I mean, we have to be careful not to make that too rigid because then it sort of just becomes a very expensive dashboard. So a lot of this is in trying to make sure that we have the flexibility of natural language and Gen AI, but then also have sort of trust where it matters. And some of this can be a two-way conversation where, if the business user is looking at it and saying, I don't know if I can trust it, we want to facilitate workflows where they can then go ask the analyst at that point, hey, this is business critical. I'm about to go present to the C-suite about this. Can you please double check and make sure? And then if the analyst blesses this, it's not just that business user gets the benefit. Everyone else who in the future asks the exact same question will also get those benefits.
Yeah. I mean, that makes lots of sense. Like I could see that. I can ask any question. I'm not sure. Hey, can you double check? And then it becomes the new metrics, and then you can have
Yeah.
And I think also you can improve the Genie. So what you can think about, like create, for example, a Genie for each, business team, marketing team, sales team. You can just add the relevant tables with the right comments, and then you can add like good instructions. So this is what I mean by this product. Those are the relevant ones. That's what I mean. If I have value 1 in my comment, this means this is, the best selling product. And then you can, what I thought about last time, that was go check the query history and see the queries that I have the most had on this specific SQL warehouse and copy them in the instruction with the explanation. And this help the users have more confidence in the answer, and by time now they're using Genie more, they have this trust on Genie to have good results.
That's right. Yeah, I mean, query history is a great source of sort of what questions have people been asking before. Now today, what we lack is the mapping of, given a query in the query history, what was the English or natural language intent behind that question. And so those are the semantics that we're trying to encourage folks to sort of provide a lot more through Genie in as easy a way as possible.
Can you revert that? Like, can you have a model based on a query kind of generating the English?
We do actually today already.
Okay.
Right? If you use Genie today, every time we generate a query, we also generate an English description with it. And so part of the challenge is making sure that that's as accurate as possible as well.
And I think it will be, I don't know, I'm just thinking about maybe probably in the roadmap, you kind of have a Genie linked to the system table that can be accessed only for the user, where he can see the question he asked and the SQL that was generated. It's like in inference table when using the LLMs. So at the end of the month, an analyst can just go and check something.
So the nice thing is we don't quite have this in the system table yet, but we do already have this in the UI. There is a monitoring tab where you can go and look at all the questions that's been asked for this particular Genie space, if you're an author of that space. And you can also look at whether people like the answers. Like there's thumbs up, thumbs down that is baked in every question. And you can actually filter by which questions got a thumbs up, which questions got a thumbs down, what was the SQL that was generated, what was the chat history of context behind that. So all of that is actually available today for people who are trying to curate these Genie spaces.
I think you build one of the most advanced, compound AI system out there. Can you share any best practices with our customers? We would like to do the same kind of system. Maybe not doing, a Genie, but something they are working on for their own business.
The secret sauce.
I don't know if it's the most advanced one, but it is certainly a pretty complex one. I think with any AI system, especially given all the sort of the probabilistic nature of the behavior there, the most important thing is to figure out the feedback loop as early as possible and figure out how you can actually make sure the system is improving over time And what signals do you have to actually confirm that ideally as close to the customer experience as possible. And so looking at the end-to-end, for example, for Genie, the end-to-end sort of request response is a natural language question with the data and the SQL that's coming back. And so we then do a lot of work to figure out, okay, how do we actually convince ourselves that we have a representative sample of such natural language questions to SQL and to the data, such that every time we make a model change, every time we even make an interface change, etc., we can actually confirm that it's headed in the right direction. So any other compound AI system, that tends to be one of the hardest parts, actually getting that contract right up front and getting enough samples of real customer interactions based on that contract where you would expect that to be correct. So the golden data set, if you will.
Yeah, makes sense. And can you share maybe a bit on the eval strategy that you have? Because I mean, if you generate SQL, you can get the same results with many different SQL. So how do you know it's working well at the end?
Yeah, and I mean, it's I would say the eval strategy is always a best effort work in progress, right? And some of it, we came up with a fairly extensive sort of set of what we believe to be representative at the beginning. Some of that is informed by our own experience. Some of that is informed by looking at what folks internally are doing at Databricks as they're playing around with Genie. But then also over time, a lot of it is going to be informed by customer feedback. Like if you give us feedback and if you give us enough permission to actually tell what you're trying to do in that feedback, then we will learn from that, and then we will sort of incorporate that over time to make sure that we don't trip over the same thing twice.
That makes sense. And I thought about something. It's it's a hard question. So, do you know why a data analyst is always a good dancer?
Oh boy, is this a joke? I'm terrible at these.
Because they know how to pivot.
Oh no.
Wow,
Remind me to
Yusuf.
remove your pivot table access.
We might cut that one, Yusuf.
I walk right into that one.
And by the way, can you tell us more about the roadmap? Like, what may be coming to Genie?
There's a lot I can't talk about yet, but I would say the things that we've already started hinting at, even at Summit, are things like, for example, tighter integration between dashboards and Genie, where we can try to use a dashboard to sort of bootstrap a Genie space so that you have to do less work in setting it up. Ideally, if you can ask a dashboard a question, you should be able to ask the exact same question in Genie, and then you can ask all the questions around it. So that's a sort of a big area that we are sort of increasingly focusing on. And, some of it is just making sure that it's as easy to use as possible. And then sort of making Genie accessible to as many people as possible. Like we know a lot of folks don't actually want any random business user to be in their workspaces. We know that they want business users to maybe just have access to Genie and nothing else. And so we're looking at various ways of making that much more usable as well. And so those are, I would say, two of the bigger themes. But then a big part of the roadmap that you may not see as obvious sort of big launch features are just like refining the quality of the answers and making sure that we get the answers right by default a lot more frequently so that you as a author have to provide fewer and fewer instructions over time. And so hopefully you will just see over time as sort of natural improvements in Genie.
Nice. So what's the integration between Genie and the AI assistant that we have? Like if you ask a business question in the AI assistant, for example, from Notebook, is it going to trigger Genie also? How does it work?
Oh, that's interesting. So you're thinking assistant specifically?
Yeah.
Yeah. So we basically framed assistant as more of the companion AI thing for technical users and Genie as the thing that answers your questions for business users. And so in some ways, they're complementary to each other for two different crowds. I could certainly see over time things that you learn from Genie or things that you learn from Assistant benefiting each other. But we'll have to be very careful about the governance angle, making sure that the right people can only answer the right access the answers for the right questions, given the level of access they have in the Unity catalog. And so again, the nice thing about Unity catalog is it will solve all of the who gets access to what kind of questions, so that Genie and Assistant can sort of act as purely applications on top of that.
Yeah, and I think like for those who are watching this recording after 30 minutes, you know why Chao and his team are superstars. They are really delivering a masterpiece and working on one of the coolest projects ever. And because like it's easy to make technical stuff, but not democratizing access and making the data accessible to everyone. So really thank you for your hard work.
Thank you. I'm going to go hide behind that chair or something, because no, the credit really goes to the team. There's a lot of really cool, really innovative work happening across the board, whether it's building the right models, whether it's scaling a lot of really powerful systems, whether it's figuring out the right human-computer interaction so that we can actually make the work of both the analyst and the business user as easy as possible. There's a lot of fun things we're doing here, and we're nowhere near done yet. So looking forward to all the stuff that we're doing in the coming quarters and years.
All right, thank you so much.
Yeah,
let's so give it a try. Log to Databricks, go in Genie, start your first discussion, and see all the magic happening for you.
Yeah, and tell us how you like it. We always love more feedback. That's how we actually grow the product faster.
Perfect.
Awesome.
Thank you, Chao.
Thank you.
Thank you.